They called him the Silent Blade of Seoul. Kim didn't just rule the city, he owned its shadows. His mansion was a tomb of marble and secrets, guarded by a single, unbreakable law. No one enters without an invitation. But when the shelters turned Agnes and her frail grandmother away, Agnes had no choice but to lead her only family into the lion's den. Before we reveal the moment the Viper's trap finally snapped shut, we want to hear from you. We are building a global community here at Blood and Roses Chronicles, and stories like Kim and Edna's remind us that loyalty and kindness have no borders. We want to know exactly where in the world you are witnessing this justice unfold. Are you watching from Seoul, Los Angeles, or somewhere else entirely? Drop your city or country in the comments below. We love seeing how far these chronicles of integrity reach. While you're down there, make sure to like this video and hit that subscribe button to join the fold. If you believe that a single act of kindness can change a life decades later, share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Your support is the fuel that keeps these shadows alive. Now, back to the mansion, where the silence is about to be broken. The heavy metal doors groaned open. Thunder shook the floorboards. Agnes's breath hitched as a line of men in black suits flanked the hall. Then came the sound that haunted her dreams, the slow, rhythmic click of Kim's leather shoes. He appeared like a ghost, his face a mask of stone. Agnes squeezed her eyes shut, shielding Edna with her own body, waiting for the end. But the shot never came. Instead, there was a heavy, rustling thud. When Agnes opened her eyes, she gasped. The man who had never looked anyone in the eye was on both knees, his forehead pressed to the floor in a cungiole. "Mother," he whispered, his voice trembling. "You finally came home." The heavy mahogany doors of the mansion didn't just close, they sealed the world out. Agnes stood in the foyer, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps as the scent of expensive sandalwood and cold rain filled her lungs. She looked down at her grandmother, Edna, who was still clutching her worn leather handbag, her eyes wide with a childlike wonder that broke Agnes's heart. Edna didn't understand that they were standing in the heart of a kingdom built on silence and steel. Just hours ago, Agnes had been a shadow in this house, a ghost in a crisp uniform whose only job was to ensure not a single speck of dust offended the master. She had lived by the one rule that kept her head on her shoulders: never let your outside life cross the threshold. But the 3 a.m. phone call from the nursing home had shattered that barrier. The frantic voice of the nurse describing the rising floodwaters, the lack of space, the absolute necessity to come get her now, it had left Agnes with no options. Her own apartment was a mold-infested ruin she'd been forced to vacate weeks ago. She was a woman with no floor beneath her feet, and the only roof she had access to belonged to the most dangerous man in Seoul. The drive through the storm had felt like a descent into a nightmare. Every time lightning illuminated the dashboard, Agnes saw the face of Kim, the man the staff whispered about in hushed, terrified tones. He was a man who had once ordered a subordinate's hand broken for a simple lie. What would he do to a maid who brought a stranger into his fortress? Agnes had smuggled Edna through the service entrance, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had hidden her in the small, windowless staff break room, praying that the master wouldn't return until dawn. But fate was a cruel playwright. The roar of a high-performance engine had signaled Kim's early return, and before Agnes could move Edna, her grandmother had wandered out, lost in the fog of her dementia, seeking a comfortable chair. Now, as the Silent Blade himself stood before them, Agnes felt the world tilting. Kim's black suit was rumpled, a dark, wet stain on his shoulder that smelled metallic, fresh blood. His eyes, usually as sharp as the weapon he was named after, were fixed on Edna. Agnes's legs turned to lead. She moved a step between them, her hands trembling as she prepared to beg, to scream, to offer her life for the woman who had raised her. "Please, master," Agnes choked out, her voice a fragile thread. She has nowhere else to go. The flood. The words died in her throat. Kim didn't reach for the weapon at his waist. He didn't signal the stone-faced guards flanking the hall. Instead, his entire frame seemed to collapse inward, the rigid, lethal posture of a predator dissolving into something raw and unrecognizable. The heavy thud of his knees hitting the marble echoed through the silent hall. He lowered his head until it nearly touched Edna's shoes, a congeal, a bow of such profound reverence it was reserved only for those who owned one's soul. In that moment, the terrifying myth of the silent blade evaporated. There were no bosses or servants in the room, only a man, a woman, and a debt of grace that had finally come due. The silence in the marble hall was so heavy it felt as though the air itself had solidified. The bodyguards stood like pillars of salt, their eyes wide, unable to reconcile the sight of the most feared man in the underworld kneeling at the feet of an old woman in a faded cardigan. Kim's forehead remained pressed to the cold stone, his shoulders shaking with the suppressed force of a decade's worth of grief and relief. Edna looked down, her cloudy eyes blinking as she reached out a frail, weathered hand to touch the dark silk of his hair. "Why, you're just a boy," she murmured, her voice a soft, melodic contrast to the clinical coldness of the mansion. "And you're still so thin. Have you not been eating, child?" The sound of her voice, the specific, soulful cadence of it, seemed to shatter the final remains of Kim's armor. He looked up, his face wet with tears that no one in Seoul had ever been allowed to see. For a fleeting second, the silent blade was gone, replaced by a ghost from 1995. Los Angeles had been a concrete furnace that summer. An 8-year-old Kim, then known only as Miho, had been discarded by an uncle who found a child too burdensome for his gambling debts. Miho had been hiding behind a dumpster in a South Central alley, his small ribs aching from a beating delivered by 3 local teenagers who didn't like the way he looked or the fact that he couldn't speak their language. He had closed his eyes, waiting for the final kick, when a sound like a crack of thunder echoed off the brick walls. It was the sound of Edna's wooden cane striking the pavement. She had stood there like a prophet, her eyes blazing with a righteous fire that sent the bullies scattering. She didn't speak Korean, and he didn't speak English, but when she knelt in the dirt and wiped the blood from his lip with a lilac-scented handkerchief, the language didn't matter. For 3 months, her tiny apartment above a laundromat became his universe. She had fed him collard greens and cornbread, teaching him that grace wasn't just a prayer said before a meal, but a way of life. She had bandaged his knees and whispered that he was a king in the making, even when the world treated him like trash. She was the woman who had taught him that the world was more than just a place of shadows and knives. But the shadows had eventually claimed him. His family's syndicate had tracked him down, dragging him back to Korea to be forged into a weapon. He had screamed for her as the black sedan pulled away, clutching a small wooden cross she had tucked into his pocket. He had spent 20 years searching for that light, only to find it standing in his foyer, brought there by a maid he had barely bothered to learn the name of. Kim rose slowly, his gaze shifting to Agnes. The girl was shaking, her hands pressed to her mouth, terrified of the man she thought she knew. Kim didn't bark an order. He didn't demand an explanation. He simply stepped toward her and bowed his head, a small, genuine gesture of gratitude. "Agnes," he said, his voice thick and rasping. "From this moment, you are no longer a servant in this house. You are the granddaughter of the woman who gave me a soul. This isn't a mansion anymore. It's her home. And yours." By dawn, the atmosphere inside the mansion had shifted so violently that the very air felt heavy with unspoken questions. The staff gathered in the shadows of the servants' kitchen, their whispers like the rustle of dry leaves. They had all seen the transition, the master himself, the man who treated human life like a line item on a ledger, personally carrying Edna's worn leather suitcases up the grand staircase. Agnes stood in the center of the guest wing's primary suite, her hands hovering awkwardly at her sides. For 2 years, she had entered this room only with a microfiber cloth and a bowed head, moving quickly so as not to leave a trace of her existence. Now, she was standing on a hand-knotted Persian rug while Kim, the silent blade, personally adjusted the thermostat. "The sunlight hits this corner at 8 a.m., Kim said, his voice stripped of its usual razor-edged authority. He was looking at Edna, who had already claimed a velvet armchair and was busy inspecting a vase of fresh peonies. "It's the warmest room in the house. I've had the medical alert system integrated into the bedside console. If you need anything at all, you only have to press the gold button." Edna squinted at him, a mischievous glint cutting through the fog of her memory. "It's a bit gaudy, mijo. Too much gold for a man who used to sleep on my corduroy couch." Kim actually flinched, a faint, ghost-like smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I remember the couch, Halmoni. It was more comfortable than this." He turned his attention to Agnes, and the air in the room sharpened. "Agnes, your uniform. Take it off." Agnes froze, her heart leaping into her throat. But Kim wasn't looking at her with the cold eyes of a predator. He was looking at her with the weighted gaze of a man trying to balance an ancient scale. "You are done cleaning floors," he stated. His tone brook no argument. "The head butler has already been informed. You will be moved into the room adjacent to your grandmother's. You are no longer staff. You are family. If any man in this house or this city treats you as anything less, they answer to me." Agnes felt a tear prick the corner of her eye. The transition was too fast, a dizzying ascent from the basement to the penthouse of power. She looked at her grandmother, who was now hum-singing a soft gospel tune, seemingly unimpressed by the marble and the bodyguards. Edna had always said that kindness was a seed that took its own time to grow. Agnes just never imagined the harvest would look like a Mafia fortress. Outside the door, the head of security stood frozen, his hand resting on the hilt of his weapon. He had spent years watching Kim eliminate weaknesses, yet here was the boss, personally ensuring an old woman had enough pillows. The hierarchy of the Silent Blade had been dismantled by a single deep bow. As Agnes watched Kim lead Edna toward the balcony to see the garden, she realized that the mansion was no longer a tomb. The devil had invited the light inside, and for the first time in his life, he looked like he could finally breathe. The following week in the mansion felt like a glitch in reality. The cold, mechanical efficiency of the Kim syndicate had been replaced by a strange, domestic tension that left the most dangerous men in Seoul looking utterly bewildered. It started during a high-stakes meeting in the grand dining room. Kim sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of granite as he listened to a lieutenant describe a territory dispute with a rival faction. The air was thick with the threat of violence until the heavy double doors swung open with a rhythmic thud-clack, thud-clack. Edna marched in, her wooden cane leading the way like a commander's baton. Behind her, Agnes followed, looking as though she wanted to vanish into the wallpaper. The bodyguards instinctively reached for their waistbands, then froze, their hands hovering over cold steel as they realized who had breached the sanctum. "Mijo," Edna snapped, her voice cutting through the talk of logistics and bloodshed. "I can hear your voice all the way in the garden. Why are you shouting at these boys? And sit up straight, you look like a street thug." The silence that followed was absolute. The lieutenant, a man who had personally overseen the dismantling of 3 rival gangs, stared at his boss in horror. Kim, the Silent Blade, looked at the map of Seoul spread across the table, then at his grandmother. Slowly, almost mechanically, he adjusted his posture, pulling his shoulders back and smoothing the lapels of his suit. "We are discussing business, Halmoni," Kim said, his voice dropping an octave in a desperate attempt to retain his dignity. "Business is no excuse for bad manners," Edna countered. She walked to the table and tapped her cane against a stack of surveillance photos showing the Vipers' hideouts. "And look at this table. Not a green thing on it. You'll be gray and withered before you're 40 if you keep eating like this." She turned her sharp gaze to the head of security, a man nicknamed the Butcher. "You." Go tell the kitchen I want steamed broccoli and rice on this table in 10 minutes. For everyone. The butcher looked at Kim. Kim looked at the floor. Do as she says, the boss muttered. For the next hour, the most powerful criminals in the city sat in stiff, terrified silence, eating small florets of broccoli under the watchful eye of an elderly woman in a floral dress. Agnes sat beside her grandmother, biting her lip to keep from laughing as she watched a hitman struggle to use his fork properly. Later that evening, the comedy of the afternoon faded into a sharper reality. Kim was on his cell phone on the balcony, his voice low and lethal as he issued a final warning to a traitor. He didn't hear the thud-clack of the cane until it was too late. Edna stood in the doorway, her expression weary. The boy I knew had a heart like a song, she said softly. The man I see now carries a storm in his pocket. Kim closed his eyes and ended the call. The world is different here, Halmoni. Grace doesn't protect you from the Viper. No, Edna replied, stepping closer to touch the hand that held the phone. But love makes you worth protecting. The shift in the mansion's atmosphere had not gone unnoticed by the city's underworld. In a windowless room beneath a shipping container at the Incheon docks, Lee Sang-woo, known to his enemies as the Viper, flipped through a series of grainy, long-lens photographs. The images were a mockery of the Kim legacy. They showed the Silent Blade carrying a tray of tea into a garden. They showed him leaning down so an elderly black woman could straighten his silk tie. They showed him walking defenselessly beside a girl in a simple sundress. The Viper let out a dry, rasping laugh that sounded like shifting gravel. They say the devil has retired, he whispered to the shadows. But it seems he's simply found something he's afraid to lose. Back at the mansion, the air felt electric, charged with a premonition of disaster. Agnes felt it first. She noticed the way the security detail had doubled, the way the guards no longer looked bored but stood with their hands perpetually white-knuckled on their holsters. Kim had become a ghost again, but not the cold, indifferent one she had once served. He was a man possessed, his eyes darting to every window, his phone never leaving his hand. The black SUV is back, Agnes whispered, finding Kim in the study. She had seen it from the upstairs balcony, the same tinted windows, the same predatory crawl past the main gates. Kim didn't look up from his desk, but his jaw tightened until the bone threatened to break through the skin. I know. Kim, if this is because of us, if we are putting you in danger, we can leave. We can find a way, Agnes pleaded. Kim finally looked at her, and for a second, the stone mask cracked. You don't understand, Agnes. You didn't bring danger into this house. You brought the only thing worth defending. The Viper doesn't want my territory. He wants my soul. He thinks that by taking Edna, he can turn me back into the monster he understands. He stood up, his height casting a long, jagged shadow across the room. He is wrong. I was a monster because I had nothing. Now I am something much worse. I am a man with a home. That night, the Viper's opening move was subtle, a psychological strike meant to test the perimeter. A single courier arrived at the gate with a gift for the grandmother of Seoul. Inside the silk-wrapped box was not jewelry or tea, but a single, crushed peony, the same flowers Kim had placed in Edna's room, and a spent shell casing engraved with the name Miho. Kim stood in the foyer, staring at the metal casing in the palm of his hand. The message was clear. The sanctuary had been breached. The Viper knew exactly which room Edna slept in. He knew which flowers she liked. He knew the name she called him in the privacy of their reclaimed bond. Double the watch on the east wing, Kim commanded, his voice a low, terrifying vibration. And bring the armored cars to the front. We are no longer waiting for the storm. The storm is already inside the gates. The tension within the mansion had reached a boiling point, a thick, suffocating fog that even the heavy scent of Edna's slow-simmering beef stew couldn't mask. Kim spent his hours pacing the surveillance room, his eyes bloodshot as they tracked the thermal signatures of the men circling his perimeter. He had already prepared the safe house in Jeju, a concrete bunker disguised as a luxury villa, reachable only by a private jet already idling on the tarmac. When he entered the dining room to break the news, he found Edna sitting by the window, her cane hooked over the back of her chair. She wasn't looking at the gardens, she was looking at him, her eyes sharp and clear, stripped of the usual cloudy haze of her condition. "The bags are packed, Halmoni," Kim said, his voice tight with an urgency that bordered on panic. "The cars are in the subterranean garage. We leave in 20 minutes. You and Agnes will be safe there. The Viper won't be able to find you." Edna didn't move. She didn't even blink. "I've spent a lifetime running from men who thought they owned the world, Miho. I ran from the heat in Georgia. I ran from the sirens in Los Angeles. I am 78 years old, and my legs are tired." "This isn't about your legs," Kim snapped, the silent blade flickering in his eyes. "This is about your life. These men, they don't have rules. They don't have hearts. And you think I don't know that?" Edna stood up, using her cane not for support, but to point directly at his chest. "I saw the look in your eyes when you came home with blood on your cuffs. I saw the shell casing you tried to hide in the trash. You think because I forget where I put my glasses that I forget what evil looks like." She stepped closer, her small frame dwarfed by his shadow, yet it was Kim who seemed to shrink. "If I leave, you will turn back into the man you were. You will burn this city down to find the people who scared me away, and you will lose your soul in the fire. I didn't find you after 20 years just to watch you become a ghost again." Agnes stood in the doorway, clutching a packed duffel bag, her gaze darting between the two of them. "Nan, he says they're coming. He says the gates won't hold." "Then let them come," Edna said, her voice dropping into a register of absolute, unshakable iron. She reached out and took Kim's hand, the one that had held 1,000 cold weapons, and squeezed it. "A house is only a fortress if the people inside are worth the stone. I am staying right here. You are my son, and a mother does not leave her son to face the devils alone." Kim looked at her, his throat working as he fought back the desperate urge to argue. He saw the fire in her, the same fire that had stood down 3 bullies in a Los Angeles alley with nothing but a wooden stick. He realized then that she wasn't his weakness, she was his anchor. If he moved her, he drifted. "Agnes," Kim whispered, never taking his eyes off Edna. "Unpack the bags. Secure the inner doors." He leaned down, pressing his forehead against Edna's in a gesture of shared battle. "We stay." The storm that had been brewing for weeks didn't arrive with thunder, but with the sharp, rhythmic shatter of the east wing's glass. It happened at 2:14 a.m. The mansion's power was severed instantly, plunging the marble corridors into a predatory darkness lit only by the red strobe of the failing security scanners. Kim was moving before the first alarm could scream. He didn't head for the armory, he headed for the master suite. "Agnes." "The panic room now." Kim's voice was a low roar, vibrating through the smoke that began to curl along the ceiling. Agnes scrambled from her room, clutching Edna's arm. They moved through the hallway as the sounds of the siege erupted below, the muffled thump of suppressed gunfire and the heavy boots of the Viper's elite shock troops. Kim met them at the threshold of his study, his silhouette framed by the flickering emergency lights. He looked less like a businessman and more like a myth. He held a sleek submachine gun in one hand, his jaw set in a line of pure, lethal intent. He slammed his palm against the biometric scanner hidden behind a bookshelf. The heavy steel door of the panic room groaned open. "Get inside," he commanded, his eyes darting to the end of the hallway where a shadow had just detached itself from the wall. "Miho, wait," Edna started, her voice remarkably calm despite the chaos. "There's no time, Halmoni." Kim shoved them inside, but as he reached for the internal locking mechanism, a jagged explosion rocked the floor. A grenade had detonated in the server room directly below. The floor tilted, and a shower of sparks rained from the ceiling. Kim punched the close button, but the red error light blinked mockingly. The blast had warped the track. The massive door hung open by a foot, jammed and useless. Footsteps thundered toward them. 4 men in tactical gear rounded the corner, their laser sights painting red dots across the mahogany walls. Kim didn't hesitate. He stepped into the gap, positioning his body directly in front of the opening, his frame completely obscuring Agnes and Edna from the gunman's view. The first burst of gunfire chewed into the doorframe. Kim returned fire with clinical precision, dropping the lead attacker, but the other 3 split up, flanking the narrow corridor. He was pinned. One of the Viper's men realized the door was jammed and adjusted his aim, shifting his barrel toward the gap where Edna's floral dress was visible. "No!" Kim screamed. He threw himself sideways, not to take cover, but to act as a living shield. The hallway erupted in a blinding flash of muzzle fire. Kim felt the hammer blow of a bullet punching into his shoulder, spinning him around, but he refused to fall. He braced his feet against the marble, his teeth bared in a snarl of agony and defiance. He wasn't the silent blade of soul in that moment. He was the boy from the alley, finally standing his ground for the only woman who had ever looked at him and seen a person instead of a weapon. "Stay back," he gasped, his vision blurring as he fired his final rounds into the dark. Through the haze, he saw Edna standing behind him, her hand resting firmly on his lower back, her touch the only thing keeping him upright as the world began to tilt into blackness. The smell of cordite and copper filled the narrow hallway, a bitter incense for the violence unfolding within the mansion's heart. Kim's breath came in ragged, wet hitches. The bullet in his shoulder felt like a branding iron held against his bone, but the fire in his gut was hotter. He could feel Edna's hand on his back, a small, steady weight that anchored him to the earth even as his legs threatened to turn to water. The 2 remaining gunmen, sensing the silent blade was finally fading, moved with a cruel, predatory confidence. They stepped over the bodies of their fallen comrades, their boots crunching on shattered porcelain and spent brass. One raised a tactical rifle, his finger tightening on the trigger, aiming for the gap in Kim's defense. "Miho, move." Edna's voice wasn't a scream, it was a command, the same one she had used to scatter bullies 30 years ago. She didn't wait for him to obey. With a strength that seemed to defy her frail frame, she stepped around Kim, her wooden cane raised like a saber. The lead gunman hesitated for a heartbeat, a fatal mistake. In the underworld, hesitation is a death sentence. To see an elderly woman standing amidst a bloodbath, eyes flashing with the fury of a protective mother, was a sight that fractured his professional focus. Kim seized that heartbeat. Ignoring the agony screaming through his nervous system, he lunged forward. He didn't use a gun, he used himself. He slammed into the first shooter, driving his thumb into the man's throat and twisting his body to act as a barrier for the second man's line of fire. A second bullet tore through Kim's side, a white-hot lash of pain that nearly stole his consciousness, but he didn't stop. He pinned the man against the wall and delivered a clinical, terminal strike to the temple. As the final gunman leveled his weapon at Kim's exposed head, a massive ceramic vase, a Ming Dynasty relic worth millions, sailed through the air and shattered against the shooter's skull. The man staggered, his aim veering wildly as Agnes emerged from the panic room, her face a mask of tear-streaked rage. Kim didn't let the opportunity go to waste. He stripped the weapon from the dazed man's hand and ended the threat with 3 muffled shots. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the hiss of the fire suppressors. Kim's knees finally buckled. He hit the marble hard, his blood staining the white stone in a dark, expanding map. "Miho." "Oh, my sweet boy," Edna cried, dropping her cane and falling to the floor beside him. She pulled his head into her lap, her hands shaking as she tried to stanch the flow of blood with the hem of her cardigan. Kim looked up at her, his vision swimming in a sea of gray. He reached out, his fingers stained crimson, and brushed a lock of silver hair from her face. "I told you. I'd find you," he whispered, his voice a ghost of a sound. I told you. I'd pay you back. You don't owe me a thing, Edna sobbed, pressing her forehead against his. You've been my son since that day in the alley. Just stay. Don't you dare leave me again. Kim's eyes flickered toward Agnes, who was kneeling on his other side, gripping his hand. He felt the weight of the debt finally lifted. He wasn't a boss dying for territory. He was a man dying for his family. And in that realization, the Devil of Seoul finally found peace. 6 months later, the morning sun over Seoul didn't glint off the cold steel of the mansion's gates. Instead, it warmed a vibrant terrace overflowing with Edna's favorite marigolds and climbing roses. The air, once thick with the sterile scent of polished marble and fear, now carried the heavy, mouth-watering aroma of slow-cooked brisket and jasmine tea. The bullet holes in the grand hallway had been patched, but the scars remained not as wounds, but as reminders of the night the devil died and a family was born. Kim sat on the terrace, his black suit replaced by a simple linen shirt. His left arm still rested in a slight, permanent stiffness, a souvenir from the Viper's lead, but he moved with a lightness that seemed impossible for a man with his history. Beside him, Agnes was no longer dressed in the muted tones of a servant. She sat with a laptop and a stack of blueprints, managing the legal transition of the Kim estate into a legitimate community foundation. She was the architect of their new world, her eyes bright with a purpose that went far beyond survival. Sit up straight, mijo. Edna's voice drifted from the doorway, followed by the familiar, comforting thud clack of her wooden cane. You're slouching like a tired old dog again. Kim didn't reach for a weapon or snap a cold command. He simply smiled, the expression reaching his eyes in a way it never had in his youth. Yes, Halmoni, he murmured, adjusting his posture as she approached. Edna reached his side and rested a hand on his shoulder. Her eyes were clearer now, anchored by the stability of a home that didn't move. She looked out over the gardens, where 2 of Kim's former enforcers, men once known for their brutality, were currently arguing over the proper way to prune a hydrangea bush under Edna's strict instructions. The underworld had watched the transformation of the Kim mansion with a mixture of confusion and awe. The message was clear. The violence had ended, but the strength remained. You've done a good thing here, child, Edna said, her voice softening. You took a house built on shadows and turned it into a place for the sun. I didn't do it alone, Kim replied, looking from the woman who saved his childhood to the woman who saved his future. The 3 of them sat in a shared, comfortable silence as the city hummed in the distance. The Silent Blade was a legend that belonged to the past, a ghost story told to frighten children. In his place stood a man who finally understood that power wasn't found in how many people feared you, but in whose hand you held when the world went dark. As Agnes laughed at one of Edna's stories, and Kim felt the warmth of the sun on his face, he realized that the long walk from the Los Angeles alley had finally come to an end. They were home. If that final glimpse of Agnes and Kim standing tall on a terrace filled with Edna's roses sent a chill down your spine, then click that like button right now. Subscribe to Blood and Roses Chronicles to join our community for more cinematic journeys into the shadows. Drop a comment below and let's talk about that hard-earned justice. Remember, the world might see someone silent or broken when they look at you today, but never forget, you hold a signal that can change everything. See you on the next one.